Hello there, good evening. Warships loom off Venezuela's coast. US forces seize oil tankers. Trump issues an ultimatum. Maduro must go. With 15,000 troops deployed, deadly strikes on alleged drug boats, and talk of ground operations, Washington's pressure has never been fiercer. Cuba cries piracy. The UN urges restraint. And opposition leader Maria Machado, fresh from her Nobel Peace Prize, backs US action. But with Venezuela's oil riches at stake and Russia, China and Iran watching closely, one question burns. Are we on the brink of America's next military intervention? Welcome to Think Tank.
Our world is becoming unhinged.
Welcome to the program. Now, The Hill has reported that the U.S. campaign against Nicolas Maduro and his regime is intensifying, highlighted by the recent seizure of a massive oil tanker en route to Cuba and added sanctions. President Trump justifies this aggressive stance by citing Venezuela's role in illegal drug trafficking into the United States and the perceived security threat from a rising tide of Venezuelan migrants, including alleged criminals and gang members entering American borders. Beyond security claims, the U.S. actions are strategically targeting Venezuela's oil exports, which represent nearly 90% of its revenue. By seizing tankers, the U.S. effectively imposes a de facto naval blockade, aiming to cripple Caracas's ability to finance its government. This economic pressure is seen by many analysts as a step towards regime change and securing access to Venezuela's vast energy reserves. The U.S. has established a massive military presence in the Southern Command region, deploying fighter jets and an aircraft carrier, indicating a serious willingness for further confrontation. While the administration's stated goal is not regime change, the actions and rhetoric, including threats of strikes, suggest Maduro's grip on power is under severe coordinated pressure, making a peaceful resolution increasingly unlikely. And according to The Conversation, the core of the current U.S. approach in Latin America is the formal revival of the Monroe Doctrine, now labeled the Trump corollary, in the new national security strategy. This strategy elevates the Western Hemisphere as the top U.S. priority, effectively ending the previous era of partnership and reasserting Washington's historical role as the region's dominant police force. This intense focus is driven by two key motives. First, the desire to contain Chinese influence in Latin America's vital strategic assets, like ports and mineral resources. Second, the administration is clearly targeting Venezuela's world-leading oil reserves and Caribbean coastline. The U.S. is applying pressure, including lethal strikes and sanctions, under the dual pretext of countering narco-terrorism, so-called, and securing U.S. preeminence. The aggressive U.S. actions, including branding Maduro a narco-dictator, and the strategic pardoning of allies, align with a foreign policy motivated purely by American first interests. For many analysts, this campaign is aimed squarely at regime change in Caracas to unlock vast privatized oil and gold wealth for U.S. investors, signaling that in this new strategy, power and obedience trump international law. So, as U.S. warships tighten their grip and a seized oil tanker ignites fury in Caracas, Washington's narco-terrorism campaign edges closer to open conflict, raising urgent questions. Is America preparing for war in Venezuela, and is regime change the real goal?
In the largest U.S. military buildup in Latin America since Panama, warships, F-35s, and 15,000 troops now encircle Venezuela. Washington claims it's fighting narco-terrorism. Caracas calls it a prelude to invasion. This week, U.S. forces seized the Skipper, a sanctioned tanker allegedly carrying Venezuelan crude to Cuba. Trump's blunt verdict, we keep it, I guess. The move, denounced by Venezuela and Iran as international piracy, marks the first direct confiscation of Venezuelan oil since 2019. President Nicolas Maduro insists the United States seeks not drugs, but regime change and control of the world's largest oil reserves. Cuba echoed that, condemning the seizure as modern-day piracy. Meanwhile, opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, fresh from accepting her Nobel Peace Prize, declared Venezuela will become a beacon of democracy. U.S. officials confirmed back-channel talks with her faction, and Trump warned Caracas against arresting her. Since September, 22 U.S. strikes have killed 87 alleged traffickers. Yet experts note most U.S.-bound fentanyl comes from Mexico, not Venezuela. Colombia remains the true cocaine hub. Hardliners like Secretary of State Marco Rubio push harder. Maduro breaks every deal. Some Republicans now openly call for ground operations despite Pentagon's silence on Phase 2 planning. But with Venezuela's army still loyal and no clear successor in place, analysts warn ousting Maduro risks chaos, not oil. The drums of regime change are beating, but war plans without exit strategies rarely end well.
And we have two great guests for you tonight to talk this through with us. From New York, P.L. De Silva, Political Science and Strategic Studies Professor. And joining us from London, Ambassador Patrick Theros, who's a former American diplomat. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here with us. I'll start with you, P.L. De Silva. 15,000 U.S. troops and the USS Gerald Ford deployed. What's going on here?
Yeah, it's not an invasion force, it's an expeditionary force. If you want to invade Venezuela, you need definitely more than 15,000 troops and the USS Gerald Ford. This is more for domestic consumption. Trump would love to distract from his domestic problems with the economy, with the Epstein files, and kind of fractures in the MAGA movement. So he'll do anything to kind of distract the U.S. voter base by doing all these really crazy things. Because actually, if you look at international law and if you look at UNCLOS, interdicting and detaining and keeping Venezuela's tanker and its oil cargo, it is tantamount to piracy on the high seas. So these are serious issues, and it's defined in UNCLOS 101, which is basically piracy is an illegal act of violence or detention for private ends on the high seas, and there's no other way under international law to analyze and look at what the Trump people in the White House are carrying out, and you can see the casualties. The admiral who was overseeing all of this in the Southern Command resigned 2.5 years before he was due to retire, and he retired, and that was it. So there's lots of fissures and cracks taking place also in the U.S. military. Not everybody is happy. Not everybody buys the story that's being spun from the White House. So it's kind of grim times. I think 2026 will be a very difficult year for President Trump with the midterms in under a year's time. And it would mean the unraveling of the second Trump presidency.
Okay, lots to unpack there. Mr. Ambassador, we're coming to you. What's your assessment of what is happening? And Pierre de Silva there saying that this is a distraction tactic from some of Trump's domestic problems. And also Pierre de Silva there laying out that this tanker seizure is piracy. He's not wrong, is he?
Well, technically speaking, it's an act of war. If I remember my international law from some half a century ago, uh, yeah, I find it difficult to describe. Piracy is usually done by non-state actors, though Britain did a lot of it back in the 1500s with Sir Walter Raleigh against Spain. But it's I wouldn't call it piracy, even though it's a great term to have in a headline, but it certainly is on the edge of an act of war. If we did this to almost any other country, for example, we have never seized an Iranian tanker that I'm aware of coming out of an Iranian port. But Venezuela is unable really to strike back, so it's an easy target. I'm torn between distraction and delusion in this particular case. Yeah, it's quite a distraction, but it's not a distraction that is working necessarily to his benefit. A good part of his own base are opposed to putting American troops on the ground, and there's certainly no way we're going to get regime change unless we do so. And as Mr. De Silva said, Professor De Silva, 15,000 troops don't constitute a sufficient force for regime change. I suppose we could try to borrow how can I say, borrow from the Israelis and try a targeted strike to take him out. But again, that wouldn't necessarily mean regime change, because you still got a very strong apparatus of the state, the Chavista state, that is not going to be, how can I say, ejected because President Maduro was killed. Somebody will move up to fill the space. And I am old enough to actively remember a fellow named Chalabi, who, when I was serving in Qatar, was the president of Qatar, I'm sorry, in Jordan, was the president and CEO of the largest bank in the country. And it turned out that he had defrauded the bank and almost destroyed the Jordanian economy, fled to the United States, where he convinced everybody that he was some sort of anti-Saddam Hussein resistance hero. And I sort of smell a little bit of that here. There are maybe not the criminality, but a lot of the delusion would be if they think that without actually putting a very significant military force on the ground, they could change the regime. They can change the person in charge, but this regime is not pulling out just because you've killed a few of its leaders. They represent, according to probably a good estimate, they have 20% of the population with them, 20% of the population against them, another 60% is just trying to keep its head down and not get into trouble. So I find it difficult to believe that we have a rational plan at the moment.
Okay. Okay, well, I'll bring Professor De Silva back in there. Patrick Theros there saying it's distraction and delusion, but also pointing to some kind of want for regime change. Do you agree with that assessment? And also, if the Trump administration does want regime change in Venezuela, why does it?
You know, as I said before, Trump would love to, have all his troubles go away by some kind of foreign policy victory, and Maduro falls, and there's regime change in Venezuela. But I mean, this is Trump's pipe dream, right? I also remember Chalabi, going into Iraq from my time at the UN, and I'm quite sure that there are whisperers like Chalabi who are whispering all sorts of stuff with regard to Venezuela, saying, "Oh, this is going to be a great success," which is what Chalabi said, and the current day Chalabis are saying similar things. to people who are gullible enough in the White House to believe this stuff. But 15,000 troops and the USS Gerald Ford is just, optics. It's not anything serious to take over a huge country like Venezuela. And, we have to also understand that, you know, military dominance alone, it's not enough. It doesn't equate into strategic control of Venezuela's oil resources or anywhere else in the world. You need soft power to go along with hard power, and Trump and his lot have done away with soft power, which underpins and undergirds hard power. And without that, I don't see any kind of change happening in Venezuela. And in fact, there could be a coalition of countries shouting against and rising up against American colonialism and imperialism with the mask off.
Okay, and coming to you, Patrick Theros, what do you make of this support for Maria Corina Machado?
I think we may be putting a lot on her that she's probably not capable of doing. She came into politics rather late. She represents one faction, perhaps the most visible one, of a very, very undisciplined, fractious faction in the opposition. The opposition in the only thing that unites the opposition is the hope of overthrowing Maduro and coming to power. Every time something goes in their way, in the right way for them, such as winning the elections for the National Assembly some years back, they can't hold together. So I've long since given up trying to figure out why some people get the Nobel Peace Prize and others don't. But I think she's a very weak link. I don't believe there's no evidence that she is a full Chalabi, in that Chalabi was also a criminal. But I suspect that when she shows up, there's not going to be massive crowds at the airport welcoming her back. She's not a leader of that quality. So let's assume Chalabi goes, and let's assume his successor from the Chavista regime tries to play nice with the Americans and say, I'll do whatever you want if you call this off. That would probably be the best we could expect. But I don't, I like Professor Da Silva, simply don't understand how we could possibly achieve regime change with the forces deployed, or even probably with almost all of the U.S. Army going into a country that is somewhat bigger than Texas and has a history of armed resistance to a lot of things, including their own people. So, I mean, that would not go down well with Mr. Trump's base or with virtually anybody else in the United States. Like I say, I'm a little confused. It might be a distraction, but it's a distraction that now raises the question that you have: what next? Why have we distracted? Why are we doing this? Why have we deployed the biggest aircraft carrier in the world and several Marine and Army detachments? And it's too much. It's way too much for blockading the Venezuelan coast to grab drug dealers, and it's way too little to try and impose our will in Venezuela. So I'm willing to take anybody's suggestion at this point.
Well, it did. I'll see if Professor Da Silva can come up with some. But it is kind of out, isn't it, in the national security strategy, this so-called Trump corollary to the Monroe doctrine. Do you think the United States has much chance of pushing back the influence of countries like China in Latin America?
See, the thing is this: the U.S. has always, used military force to push forward its foreign policy initiatives and interests. The Chinese have a totally different model. They get embedded in the economy. They're into trade and finance and overhead infrastructural development, building roads, ports, airports, and they become part of the fabric. I mean, to take an example from Zambia, Zambian, people in the market were complaining that there was a Chinese man in the stall next to him selling chickens like him. The Chinese truly get embedded, and I don't see any American going to Zambia in the market and selling chickens. That's the amount of detail that the Chinese, use to work in the countries that they think are of value. So it's different models. The U.S. wants to use force. She wants to use bully boy tactics, gunboat diplomacy, and try to force countries to bend their knee. But it it causes rancor, and the policymakers and the politicians and the leaders, though they might, in public, bend their knee, there is, behind the scenes, there's a lot of unhappiness and antipathy to US policies. And I think a lot of countries in Central and South America are looking at this. And it doesn't look good for the United States going forward.
Ambassador Theros, obviously we have the U.S. Closure of Venezuelan airspace, threats of ground operations at the moment. Has the administration essentially severed all diplomatic off-ramps? So where is the international community on this? Has there been much condemnation towards the United States internationally?
There has been, by recent standards, not that much. The UN, I think the UN Secretary General said some things about we shouldn't be doing this. Clearly, this strikes a nerve throughout Central America and South America, because as Professor De Silva said, we have a long history called gunboat diplomacy, whereby we would do debt collection with a battalion of Marines, and people haven't forgotten. I served in Nicaragua a very long time ago, and we appointed an ambassador, a political ambassador, whose name was William Walker. And because somebody in the White House forgot that William Walker was also the name of a filibusterer who took control of Venezuela, of Nicaragua, back after the American Civil War, and was then killed by a heroic 14-year-old with a slingshot. But nobody could figure out why we named him. So this is all over South America, and particularly in Central America, where we had very weak countries to deal with. I think whoever sold Donald Trump on the idea of reinventing the Monroe Doctrine forgot that the Monroe Doctrine was not aimed at controlling the states of Central and South America. It was aimed at preventing European powers from reestablishing colonial control. It was, in effect, a unilateral defensive proclamation by the United States that we will prevent counter-revolution and we will prevent the old colonial countries from coming back. And when I was in high school civics, in history class, they always taught us that the Monroe Doctrine was there to prevent foreign intervention. And we saw it at the time purely as a military takeover of some country in Central or South America. Dr. De Silva is correct. The Chinese are trying very hard to establish a position, a presence, and probably don't believe in hegemony at this moment in South America. And it's going to be extremely difficult to root them out. It will be expensive. If you want to get the Chinese to leave, say, Panama, which is a country much easier for us to control, someone is going to have to pay the Chinese to move. And I don't see where that money is going to come from at the moment. And it's possible that the Chinese could be intimidated or coerced into selling their assets, but that's going to be a terribly expensive proposition. And whatever company does it is going to expect some rather lavish subsidy from the United States to run the risks.
Well, of course, the
So,
United States could always borrow it from China, I
yes.
guess. Professor De Silva, let's come to you and let's talk about oil. Of course, we all remember the accusations against the United States when it comes to Iraq. Many people think the toppling of Saddam Hussein was to do mostly with oil. When it comes to Venezuela's oil, what's the situation there? Is the United States looking in a post-Maduro world to privatizing oil from Venezuela, the oil companies?
The thing is this, we don't know what a post-Maduro administration would look like. If chaos is created, I'm quite sure that we would spark off an insurgency. And that is not good for any privatization of Venezuela's oil industry. It is certainly the world's largest proven reserves, but it's a kind of a heavy oil. It's not like the light, sweet crude that you get in Saudi Arabia or Basra Light or in Libya, which is used for blending purposes. It's a heavy crude. So therefore, I don't I don't know because you have to have stability for privatization to work, and the country next door, Guyana, is going like gangbusters. I mean, the economy is doing extremely well, and they have got their act together, and they're working to develop their economy. Venezuela is mired in corruption and bureaucracy and PDVSA, which has mismanaged, Venezuela's riches in the oil sector. So I don't see how privatization, in a post-Maduro administration would work if there is no peace and security and stability in Venezuela. If it's chaotic, all bets are off.
And Patrick Theros, President Trump, of course, was elected on an America First doctrine of non-interventions and not getting mixed up in foreign wars, of course, solving them all on day one. Now it looks like the United States is heading towards, or could be heading towards, war with Venezuela. What are the American public to make of what Trump is doing and his administration at the moment?
I think they are as mystified as the rest of us. I don't know who has been advising the president on this one. It could be the Secretary of State. Marco Rubio has always had a rather hawkish view of American policy towards leftist regimes in South and Central America. But I find it difficult to detect a policy emerging from the actions I have seen so far. Again, are we asking the Venezuelan government to act differently? Air raids and 15,000 troops are not going to help at that. We could blockade Venezuela and maybe try and force them into something, but why? People will not be happy. You're not going to get a lot of cooperation, or if you do, it'll be the kind of cooperation that leads to sabotage later. That people won't want to cooperate with the United States. I believe that President Trump has in his mind a concept of a fortress America that includes several satellite countries around us that bend to our will and thereby serve to be, an area that we control. But he doesn't seem to know that if you control an area by giving them carrots, it's going to be much more effective than controlling an area by giving them sticks, by beating them over the head. Both Canada and Mexico, I think, in the long run, would be very happy to be even more closely integrated with the United States. Whereas President Trump seems to think that they would be happy being exploited by the United States and being kept to sort of somewhat poverty-stricken neighbors.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I thank you both for your input. P.L. De Silva, political science and strategic studies professor. Thank you very much joining us from New York, and from London, Ambassador Patrick Theros, former American diplomat, of course. Thank you both for joining us here on the program. As warships circle and oil tankers vanish into U.S. ports, Trump's ultimatum to Maduro blurs the line between deterrence and invasion, risking regional chaos, global blowback, and a new contested era of American hegemony in Latin America. That brings us to the end of today's Think Tank, where we always try to unveil the complexities of our changing world. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more updates here on Qnews.